This could be the darkest story ever told. Today, we're talking about the original Jeffrey Epstein, a man practically made of Teflon who got away with thousands of children to powerful people, and worked alongside two of America's most notorious serial killers, John Wayne Gacy, the Clown, and Dean Corll, the Candyman. John David Norman isn't a name that's familiar to most Americans, but it is a name that every American should be familiar with. If you examine this story that we're going to be talking about today, you will understand Epstein, you will understand Frank Sheldon and the North Fox Island ring, and the events that we're seeing play out today in America will make a whole lot more sense to you. I do want to warn everybody, this is going to be an incredibly infuriating, incredibly dark, incredibly disturbing episode, so viewer and listener discretion is advised. If you want to see where I got the information for today's episode, please check the resources document in the description of the show. I'm not planning on going anywhere or doing anything to myself, and all parties, as always, are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. With all that said, welcome to the Conspiracy Files. Real quickly, if you want to listen to this show fully uncensored, please consider joining me on Patreon, where I post every video that goes live here on the channel, fully uncensored. You can also listen to the show uncensored on all streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever. The censorship rules on this platform are draconian, and I've talked about this many times. I've had videos entirely removed. I've had strikes on my channel. I've had age restrictions and demonetization, so I have to play it safe here. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, please be sure to leave me a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment about your thoughts on this story. Anyways, let's dive right into it. Many times in life, we've seen justice fail to be served. Whether you live in the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, or Australia, you've likely heard of a story in your country or on your continent where someone didn't get what they deserved. This theme permeates life. Someone does something bad, cruel, or evil, and we want to see them punished for it, or at least get their so-called karma. When we see that justice is served, it's usually one of the best feelings in the world, like when someone cuts you off on the road and you see them get pulled over by a cop a mile ahead. But when the person who did wrong doesn't receive justice, it leaves us with an empty hole in our stomachs. It even makes us feel personally wronged. This is never truer than when the American justice system, supposedly one of the world's greatest institutions, fails to do its job. There have been hundreds, thousands of cases throughout American history in which the American justice system has failed time and time again. Yet, in my opinion, there's no greater failure than when the law covers for its criminals, and especially when the law or the government covers for Most people don't like to think about that idea. Most will deny it outright. They'll say that I'm crazy. I have tons of people in my comments that have said over the years that I'm insane and I'm drawing all these conclusions out of nothing, that this is all fake, and that comes either from a sense of pride in their own country, or from a sense of complete denial, or from a sense of fear that their government isn't as clean and as pure as they would believe it to be. Yet, when one man, beginning in the 1970s, was connected to not one but two infamous serial killers, a nationwide and was then allowed to continue his crimes by the very institution meant to lock him away forever, most people began to think that not all was well within the American government. This man slid by the law time and time again, conveniently escaping through shoddy police work, light sentences, or evidence that went missing, witnesses that were suddenly killed. He would be put into prison, but only for a short time before being released and allowed to continue his morbid endeavors again. He operated through something that most Americans nowadays hardly think about, a newsletter. Yet these few pieces of paper would prove to be the doorway to hell for many of America's children, and the impetus for the uncovering of one of the most diabolical and horrific in the history of the United States. Connected to the Candyman Dean Corll, the killer clown John Wayne Gacy, the infamous Franklin, and the Finders, John David Norman was much more than just one lone criminal who got lucky with short prison sentences. With the appalling work he set out to do, John David Norman may have been the keeper of the keys for one of America's best-kept secrets, a nationwide stretching from Maine to California that provided children to the highest brass of the American government. Through the pages of John David Norman's dark story, one can see the breadcrumbs that lead to a larger narrative of horror. The all but proven truth that the United States government has been, at times, complicit in the profiting from, paying for, exploitation of, and even murder of our nation's children, our most innocent, our most vulnerable. But John David Norman's story is only the beginning, tying together a weave of strands that serves as a jumping point for the darkest realization one could imagine. From one man stretches a link that connects criminal case to criminal case, turning coincidences and overlaps in evidence into seemingly planned operations. As we dig deeper in this series, we will uncover a nationwide network of meticulously orchestrated crimes against children, with each thread serving as a tether directly back to the man at the center, John David Norman. And with the man himself, a series of bizarre events transforms into a complex tapestry of manipulation and deceit perpetrated by the American justice system, showcasing the lengths that one man and one faulty system will go to achieve their sinister goals. At the end of this series, you're going to see that Epstein has already happened. The Epstein affair is nothing new. We've already seen this. This is already well documented. But what happened in the past is so sinister, so disturbing, it's mind-blowing and shocking that more people don't know about it. This is a story that involves not only the production of CSAM materials, the widespread distribution of these materials, the of children to powerful people in the US government, in the churches, in Hollywood. We're going to talk about all of that, but also allegedly the production and distribution of multiple films where children are on camera for a sick, sadistic pleasure of the viewer. So we're going to talk about all of that in this series, and by the end of this series, I think your mind is going to be changed, just like mine was. This is one of the first stories that I really dove into dealing with these topics, and I wanted to go as deep as physically possible into these stories to bring you every detail, every fact that my team and I could uncover when it came to John David Norman and his absolute web of evil. But before we get into the disturbing mechanism and the machine itself, we need to talk about the man who was running it. John David Norman, a man of great charm and intellect, effortlessly blended into society among the good people he planned to harm, masking his dark intentions as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Each crime he committed and each hand he shook became a piece of a larger puzzle, revealing a mastermind who thrived in the shadows, building an empire of death and terror. Once you begin to make the connections, there's no turning back. There will be insights that speak to a terrible truth, a demon hiding in darkness that will be placed under a spotlight. The demon, though, is many people, some sitting in dim one-bedroom apartments, and some sitting in places of the highest power. But at the end, all of them came back together to complete one sinister goal, the of America's children. When Mr. and Mrs. Earl Norman gave birth to their son, John David, on October 13th, 1927, a series of events would begin that set in motion one of the worst criminal cases against children that our country has ever seen. John David Norman was born in Ada, Oklahoma, a town located an hour and a half southeast of Oklahoma City. Not much is known about John David Norman's childhood, but it's clear that he moved around a lot. He attended Horace Mann School and Ada Junior High in Ada, Oklahoma, but he made his first move to Houston in 1943. John David Norman, throughout his life, is known to have lived in California, Colorado, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Texas, and one can only imagine why it is that he moved around so frequently. Because he began committing his crimes fairly early in life, with the first being recorded when John David Norman was 26 years old, it's likely that he kept moving around to avoid his own reputation. Yet, shockingly, he gained a magnificent reputation as a teenager. It was only later in life that he ruined it with his reprehensible actions. Though little is known about Norman's life before he became infamous for his crimes against children, there is some information out there that suggests he was recognized as an extremely intelligent young man. You see, in 1944, the Ada Weekly News, a news journal published in his hometown, wrote a story about John David Norman which highlighted his many accomplishments as a teen. He was only 16 years old when Norman first appeared in the printed word, but only later would his stories turn to horror. This early news clipping showed a promising young man, a man who would likely grow up to do something great, to impact people's lives in a positive way. If the writers of the Ada Weekly News had an inkling of John David's true nature, they didn't show it with their writings. The Ada Weekly News had only good things to say about Norman. In their article titled John David Norman Wins Scholarship, published on July 27, 1944, we get a little bit of insight into Norman's background. In the article, a black and white picture of John David Norman wearing a suit and tie lies above a caption reading, "Former Aiden works now at Houston Station, studies piano, pipe organ." The article announced that John had won a $900 scholarship for writing the best paper in a contest about the US Constitution. Adjusted for inflation, Norman had won around $16,123. Participating in a competition with 63 other Houston students, John David Norman was only one of 2 participants to win the contest about the country's most important legal document, which is ironic considering the crimes he would go on to commit. At the time, Norman was living in Houston and no longer called Ada, Oklahoma his home. Yet, the people in his hometown still highlighted many of his achievements from across state lines. They were incredibly proud of the boy who had come from their city, and they thought that he represented a shining example for their city. On top of winning a competitive scholarship, the paper went on to mention the Edgar Bergen Radio Award, of which Norman was also a recipient. After reporting on these accolades, they also discussed John David Norman's education. They stated he had completed high school in just 3 years and 1 summer and had planned his classes meticulously so he could graduate early. Coming that September, they said in the article, he would enter the School of Speech at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. The news clipping then mentions him as the youngest radio engineer ever to work at Houston station KTRH, stating that soon his picture would be appearing in a national radio magazine. Employed at KADA for a time, Norman also worked at the Kiwanis Club as a pianist and at the Edward Bach Sunday School. From the article, we know that John David Norman also studied at the Houston Conservatory of Music and learned to play the piano as well as the pipe organ. The Ada Weekly newspaper seemed to know a lot about Norman, and they stated that he got his interest in piano from the federally sponsored OU training program, learning to play at the East Central College. From all these accolades and accomplishments, one would take a look at that article and expect that the man would grow into a person that would become famous for his work in radio or music. And although he eventually would become famous, it definitely wasn't for anything positive. You see, because of what came next, it is clear that John David Norman was not the innocent pianist and promising young man that article in the Ada Weekly made him out to be. There was already evil in John David Norman's heart. It may even be that he showed his darkness before he was caught for the first time, yet he hid his actions as he would later on. You see, in 1954, just 10 years after the Ada Weekly published their glowing commentary on Norman's life, he was arrested for the first time, then again 2 years later. The circumstances of his initial arrest are hazy, but it was confirmed to be a charge. He was then arrested again 2 years later in 1956 for another charge. Now, these arrests were clearly recorded. However, it is unclear if he was ever convicted of the crimes he was accused of committing. These arrests would only be reported later by the New York Times in 1973, even though there was little explanation for exactly what happened. Though we don't know if his charges included offenses against minors at the time, these are the earliest signs of John David Norman's despicable proclivities, a horrid foreshadowing of what he would go on to do. And I find that interesting. We don't know exactly what John David Norman did to who with those initial 2 arrests. I'm sure you could try to FOIA the documents or comb through old papers, but my team and I couldn't find any additional details on those charges. But you're arrested for twice in about 2 years, you can definitely see a pattern forming, and people should have known right away back then that this guy was bad news. Unfortunately, back in those days, wasn't taken as seriously as it is nowadays, but yeah, I mean, nobody could have had any idea the crimes he would go on to commit. Now, the news about John David Norman dies there for a while, with 2 years passing before we see a new mention of his activities. When he comes out of hiding, though, we get another foreshadowing from a 1958 certificate of business published in Palm Springs, California. On January 2nd, 1958, the Desert Sun published the following certificate of business. Quote, "The undersigned does hereby certify that he is conducting a recording business at P.O. Box 1304, City of Palm Springs, County of Riverside, State of California, under the fictitious firm name of Desert Records, and that said firm is composed of the following person, whose name and address is as follows, to wit: John David Norman, 6041 Carlton Way, Hollywood, California. Witness my hand this 10th day of December 1957. Signed, John David Norman." End quote. Using the false name Harry Oliver, John David Norman then began to write his first newsletter under that company name, Desert Records. And these were what Norman would become the most famous for throughout his life. Newsletters that he self-published that included indecent portrayals, photographs, and depictions of minors. Newsletters that served as a catalog of young men, children, and boys that he would sell to across the country. Costing just 10 cents a copy, Norman's first paper was called Harry Oliver's Desert Rat Scrapbook, a, quote, pocket-sized newspaper covering the Great Southwest, end quote. This publication was advertised as being published 4 times a year, with its hook stating, the only newspaper you can open in the wind. The paper included comments from listeners that complimented Harry's records and music, with one comment reading, Dear Harry, we like your record of Tall Tales and have played it a lot. Our bird Bridget listens too. She doesn't talk yet, but she will soon be a bird desert rat. Cuss words and all. Aileen Anderson, Alameda, California. The paper displayed jokes interspersed between commentary, short stories, and narrations. With one reading, mountain climbers rope themselves together because there is safety in numbers. Also, it keeps the sensible ones from going home. Judging by the fact that Norman was starting up a recording company and a newsletter just after one of his arrests for it would seem that the charges were dismissed before they put him in prison. This brush with the law, though, was not enough to press Norman away from his criminal mindset. Neither was his love of radio and the written word enough to stop him. Instead, it seemed to draw him towards it, as within just 4 years of his last arrest, he would strike again. John David Norman was arrested in 1960, but this time he was placed behind bars. He had been apprehended and charged with one of the most heinous crimes a person can commit. This would seem to be the first time he was officially charged with a crime, and he served a short prison sentence, though the details on that prison sentence and the crime itself are still unclear. Norman was unable to be rehabilitated or deterred from his actions, though, even after serving prison time, as he was charged with once again just 3 years later while living in California, a charge for which he served another short prison sentence. So now he's been arrested in about a decade 4 times for nobody's catching on to a pattern. Nobody's thinking that this guy seems to be incredibly dangerous. They're just catching him and releasing him after these really short sentences. John David Norman, though, seemed to be so dedicated to committing crimes that he would rather be in prison than step away from his dark proclivities. Throughout this time when he was committing his earliest crimes, John David Norman is kind of hard to track. He moved around the country a lot, though he spent most of his time in California, and he would use fake names in the communities that he lived in to keep his true identity a secret, much like how he used the name Harry to publish his first newsletter. Likely, John David Norman put on the charm he was known to have, the fake identity of an intelligent and gifted individual with a knack for radio and writing. But what's most striking here is not the fact that John David was able to hide in these communities. What's most shocking is the fact that he would be captured and set loose on numerous occasions by 1970, although he had already been arrested 4 times for charges. He was either given short sentences or no sentences at all, and he slipped through the hands of justice that should have squeezed tight around him. But this really was only the beginning. Norman was at that point just warming up for the greater injustices he would go on to commit against America's youth. After his latest arrest, Norman would seem to find his criminal pathway. Most do. Like a thief who will start to only target homes with a quality security system because they're certain that there are costly valuables inside. After these initial offenses, John David Norman would take his crimes to a level unthought of. From the bright young man who was winning scholarships and radio awards came a monster associated with not only 2 serial killers, but multiple major that operated under the very noses of US citizens. By the end of the 60s, it seemed that Norman found his niche, and that was sending material through the mail. In 1970, the Daily News Post of Monrovia, California, published this headline: San Gabriel, West Covina men indicted by federal jury on charges. The story, based in Los Angeles, told the tale of a victory for federal officials. With the arrests they had just made, they believed at the time they may have stemmed the flow of 25% of the area's printed material. 14 indictments were brought forward against multiple individuals, the cases being named U.S. versus Marvin Miller and Covina Publishing Inc. and U.S. versus John David Norman. The indictments involved the annual distribution of more than 6 million pieces of hardcore material that was being distributed from the Los Angeles area. And these materials were being distributed far and wide. You see, it was documented that there were even people across the country in cities like Baltimore that had been receiving these publications. 6 million pieces of material were sent across the country to readers, the same number as the approximate population of the entire Philadelphia metro area. And much of that material, quote, found its way into the hands of juveniles, end quote, according to that article, with an invitation for them to send materials back through the mail. They were encouraging kids to send them Many different men were named in that article as having been part of the scheme, and most were assumed to have received the maximum 5-year sentence. John David Norman's charges, though, aren't made explicitly clear in the article, and it only states that violations of obscenity laws were committed. His conviction was sustained for the crimes, and his sentence was confirmed on October 19th of that year. While Marvin Miller, the other main suspect, got 15 years in prison, John David Norman, strangely, was sentenced to only 15 months. You can have your own opinions on whatever, but back then the laws were extremely strict on materials like this, and you have a guy that's been arrested for 4 times, cases that involved children, and he's pinched with this guy running this massive operation that is operating completely illegally and practically begging kids to send them CSAM materials, and he's only given 15 months in prison. It's weird. This would turn out to be a theme, though, later on, a habit that the law would repeat. John could be arrested on the most heinous of charges, yet it seemed like he was only ever given a slap on the wrist for his crimes. He ended up serving his time for those charges at the McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington State, and for a time afterwards was committed to a state hospital by the California Department of Mental Hygiene, booked in as a... But when he was released, John David Norman immediately returned to publishing his newsletter. Only this time, it was going to be much bigger and connected to not just one, but 2 of the most famous and horrific serial killers in American history. It was only 3 years after John David Norman's last arrest that on August 14th, 1973, detectives in Dallas, Texas received a call from an anonymous informant that a mail-order boy was being run by a man from an apartment in the city. When they acted on this tip, traveling to the location, who else would they find but John David Norman? He wasn't alone this time, however. Norman was found in the company of 5 teenaged boys. Not only was he found with minors, though, littered throughout the apartment was photographic equipment, CSAM, or as they would refer to those materials back then, mass amounts of publishing stationery, files, and literature. The amount of heinous material found in that apartment was enough to fill up an entire van, and most of it was related to something that investigators were just learning about for the first time, the Odyssey Foundation. With the files that police located were thousands of index cards, and on those index cards were written the names and addresses of clients across America that used this foundation. Many of these clients, according to reporting at the time, were prominent people, with some even being federal employees in Washington, D.C. Mail correspondence was also taken from the apartment, and much of it had been forwarded through a post office box in San Diego, registered to an organization by the name of the Norman Foundation. When police began looking further into this organization, they saw that John David Norman had set it up to appear as a non-profit mentorship program that paired an adult sponsor with a boy fellow under the guise of interstate educational trips. The sponsors would pay for the underage boys' food and lodging, as well as their travel expenses, but these trips were far from what Norman advertised. One facet of the Odyssey Foundation was that if you were to look at it from an objective perspective, it would appear that these were honorable men that were dedicating their time and money to help educate children, to give these underprivileged kids a better life, to give them an education, to mentor them, and they would be paying for these mentorship trips and their food and their hotels and whatever. But we know that this was obviously when you start looking at this, I mean, even that explanation is really sketchy, but yeah, it just got so much worse. In a book written by author Robin Lloyd titled Money or Love, Robin states that the sponsors who sponsored the Odyssey Foundation would be selected from a master list of over 50,000 prospects who wanted to join. These sponsors were then invited to join the foundation for a small enrollment fee of $15. Then, for an additional $3, these sponsors were sent a booklet called Fellows 1973, which was a catalog of photographs and biographies of hundreds of available underage boys. Sickeningly, the foundation literature explained that the Odyssey Foundation, another one of Norman's organizations and the one connected to the literature found in the apartment, would arrange for the sponsors to meet any of the young men should they so desire. Their exact wording was as follows, quote, "At a surprisingly modest cost, $20 to $40 a day plus airfare, a sponsor may expedite a fellow's planned program and gain the opportunity to share the adventure," end quote. For as little as $20, young boys, children all over America were being sold off to adult men and women, their faces pasted in a catalog as if they were an item on a menu. If that wasn't sick enough, classified ads for this callboy service were placed in both gay magazines and underground literature called boy lover newsletters, which were circulated through the U.S. Postal Service. The boys that John David Norman were mostly young runaways, as in the 1970s runaway culture was prolific, as was male. These children would then be sent all over the United States and forced into reliance on the deviant individuals who had paid for their time, and based on what would be found out later, potentially their lives as well. The service became a statement amongst who searched for children to and film. According to case documents, quote, sponsors would contact the Dallas headquarters of the foundation, which would then send a fellow to the sponsor's home. The sponsor would notify the organization how long he wanted the fellow to stay and then pay the boy's fare to his next assignment, end quote. Now, keep in mind, when we're saying fellow, we're talking about children. We're talking about young, very young boys. No one to this day knows exactly what horrors were inflicted to how many children through the Odyssey Foundation, but evidence points to many of these boys being victims of something even worse than could have been feared in people's wildest imaginations. As if selling boys to adults all over the country wasn't bad enough, let alone selling boys to prominent figures in the U.S. government, local doctors, prominent church members, celebrities. More stomach-turning news would come when the detectives on the case discovered a word written on 4 individual photos and descriptions of children that were found in the Odyssey Foundation literature. A 21-year-old man named Charles Brizendine had been staying with John David Norman at his apartment from which he ran his child. Brizendine had replied to one of the published ads and had been invited by a sponsor to come to Dallas to check the foundation out, to check the children out. When he arrived in Dallas, Brizendine spent the night in John David Norman's apartment. He would state that he and Norman had, and afterwards, Norman explained his operation to the young man. According to Brizendine, Norman explained that he maintained a facade of a helpful organization, but at the same time preyed upon the young and easily influenced minds of young children. However, Brizendine wasn't buying Norman's explanation. He could see through the lies. Norman was procuring boys for, and many of the young men who would serve as fellows were being lured into a trap. Brizendine didn't immediately leave, however. He began to look through the Odyssey's literature that Norman had in the apartment instead. In it, he found that several of the fellows, the children that were advertised as being essentially for sale, were missing, and information pertaining to them had been stamped with one blood-chilling word: kill. Brizendine, horrified, connected these cards and these photos and descriptions of children to something else that was happening at the time. You see, in August of 1973, the Houston mass murders had been taking the news by storm. The Houston mass murders had seen a minimum of 28 young men and boys murdered in cold blood, many of whom were found buried under a boat shed, their lives having been taken by the infamous serial killer Dean Corll, otherwise known as the Candyman. But it wasn't just the photographs that were stamped with kill that connected these two situations. John David Norman had been on the phone continuously, making calls all the time to Houston. Phone records show this, and it seemed incredibly irritable anytime the Houston murders came up in conversation with acquaintances. These two pieces of evidence were far too connected for Brizendine to take lightly. He then became convinced that the Odyssey Foundation, a supposed helpful organization for young men, was connected somehow to Dean Corll and the murder of those 28 boys. When the news of John David Norman's arrest and his made it to the headlines, the possible link to Dean Corll was alluded to but never fully substantiated. The public at the time only knew that a tip on the Odyssey Foundation had come from an informant who had been frightened by the murders in Houston. The claim was mainly unsubstantiated though, because shockingly, no one ever bothered to look into the connection. This is something that we're looking into now in the modern day, but back then it was completely written off and ignored. Previously, John David Norman getting off with a slap on the wrist for running a nationwide publication just seemed like sour justice. But when the Dallas police, after talking to John David Norman, looked over the potential connections between he and serial killer Dean Corll and brushed it off, it really starts to look like a lot more than just faulty judges and bad decisions. The public, in fact, at the time knew that they had found stamped photographs in John David Norman's apartment, with the New York Times at the time having reported, quote, Assistant Police Chief Donald Steele reported that 4 pictures of young boys found in the apartment had the word kill written on them, End quote. But the Times then continued, and what came next is almost so ridiculous that it defies belief. They said, quote, "The police said they were told the word referred to the boys' removal from the procurement rings literature because they were uncooperative and did not mean they had been ordered killed." End quote. Very convenient explanation. Texas detectives did an excellent job brushing the photos under the rug. For some reason, they were ready and willing to just accept John David Norman's bogus explanation and believe it at face value. There's no real evidence that they actually ever looked into this, besides, asking John David Norman, "What does this mean?" Him saying, "Oh, well, those are people that I fired." Oh, okay. It seemed, though, that was a handy excuse for Texas officials, saying that kill only meant removing the boys from the catalog. Apparently, they didn't think it was even enough of a link to look into, nor were the clients that John David Norman had amassed, and those note cards with all the clients' information on them. Because, you see, and this is one thing that absolutely infuriates me to my core, the kill cards weren't the only thing treated as non-evidence in that initial case. The thousands of client cards that were seized from John David Norman's apartment were labeled essentially as being irrelevant. Keep in mind, this is thousands of note cards containing the names and addresses of known who were participating in a child, and it's like they didn't even look at them. You see, when the client cards were seized from Norman's apartment, they were quickly handed over, for some reason, to Henry Kissinger's State Department, and shockingly, as reported, they were destroyed. Henry Kissinger was an American diplomat, the U.S. Secretary of State, and National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford throughout the 1970s. Yet, for some unknown reason, those cards, which were found in John David Norman's apartment in Dallas, Texas, were handed over to the State Department, the federal agency, and they were then destroyed. The department destroyed the evidence rather than looking into any potential connections between the mass murder spree that happened in nearby Houston and the mail order service that could have potentially been supplying some of those young victims. The destruction of evidence was later confirmed by the State Department itself in an official statement to the Chicago Tribune 5 years later in 1977, as well as in an official letter written at the request of a U.S. congressional inquiry into child that was held that same year. For reference, these client cards were not a list of 10 or 20 men. Seized from the apartment and written down in official logs were no less than 30,000 different index cards, which listed, according to some counts, potentially over 100,000 clients around the country in at least 35 different states here in America, and according to reporting, many of the people found on these cards were prominent figures, some in the federal government, some in the Hollywood system, some in their local communities. A lot of these people on these cards were notable names. Lieutenant Harold Hancock eventually gave a statement to the Chicago Tribune on the matter of the note cards and said, quote, "I felt that some federal agency should get the cards, and I contacted the State Department through the FBI. All the cards were sent to Washington to the State Department, and that's the last I heard of it." End quote. However, the State Department, of course, provided official reasoning for the destruction of the cards. They were looking for relevance to any fraud cases containing passports. And so, because they didn't find any relevance to a passport fraud case, the cards were destroyed. Now, that makes no sense to me. It shouldn't make sense to you either. It should make sense to nobody. You have an entire database of criminals that are children with their addresses. You can go knock on these doors and investigate and arrest these people. You're practically handed the gold standard of evidence directly from the evil dude's lair, and they instead claim that they destroyed the evidence because it had no relevance to a completely different criminal case and investigation. Yeah, I mean, and that's just the very beginning, guys. This is the very beginning. We're barely into this story. The State Department's spokesperson, Matthew Nimitz, was unable to tell the Chicago Tribune why the State Department only looked at the cards from the standpoint of possible passport fraud instead of a mass child. Nor was he able to explain why the cards were not turned over to the FBI or postal inspectors. But how could this have happened? And why would the cards have been destroyed? Well, You see, only days after the Odyssey Network was revealed to the public through reporting after John David Norman's initial arrest in Dallas, a Dallas field agent in Los Angeles reported the case to Washington, D.C. The State Department was only too happy to help, and on August 23rd, a State Department agent was sent to aid the Dallas Police Department in their investigation. However, that agent wasn't there to help investigate a child. He was there to inspect the fraudulent use of passports. When the Dallas PD revealed a bombshell that 2 names on the index cards matched the names of State Department employees, this information was relayed to Washington by September 5th, 1973. The department confirmed that the names were similar to those found on the cards, with one of the employees being assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City. However, nothing ever came of the investigation into the matter. In December of 1974, Dallas PD handed over the client cards to the State Department in their entirety. According to records, the State Department then held on to those cards for almost a full year, but the cards were then destroyed in September of 1975. There is, to my knowledge, no surviving information from those cards. There was never any formal investigation into those cards. There were no big bombshells that came from those cards. And I think it's funny relating to modern times because there is this almost myth of the Epstein list. Right now we're getting all these disclosures with Epstein, and I know a lot of people believe in an Epstein list. They think like legitimately there's like a piece of paper out there that has the names of the clients that were requesting children from Epstein. But that doesn't exist. That's never existed. However, in this case, this is a literal Epstein list. This is a list of clients and addresses who were hooked up to this, and they were destroyed. There's no information relating to those cards at all, anywhere. It was never recorded. It was never written down. They were just destroyed. It is quite convenient, though, that a State Department whose employees were at the time, according to reporting, suspected to be a part of it, covered up their involvement and protected their own employees by destroying the cards. Luckily for them, the only concern of the U.S. government in this case was passport fraud. It was not the of children nationwide by powerful people throughout the government and throughout the US population. In 1976, though, a few years later, the FBI came snooping around, requesting to view the State Department's information on the Odyssey Network. Luckily for the State Department, however, the information had been completely expunged. This can be verified through various avenues and various reporting. They didn't have any investigation notes on the Odyssey Network. They didn't have any files or information on the network or the perpetrators or the criminals. They had nothing. It was like they took the files, brought them out back to a massive bonfire, and just lit them all ablaze. A Dallas PD lieutenant involved in John David Norman's arrest stated the following in response to an internal information request, saying, quote, that Norman, at the time of his arrest, had an extensive card file and numerous pieces of correspondence from individuals located throughout the United States. Lieutenant Redacted stated that he recalls some of the pieces of correspondence were from individuals located in the Washington, D.C. area and who were possibly employees of the federal government, end quote. The lieutenant then stated the evidence was handed to the State Department in its entirety in 1974, with the State Department later telling the FBI that it had all been destroyed, except for a few minor items. The cards were destroyed, and the potential leads between John David Norman and serial killer Dean Corll were all but eradicated. But what became of John David Norman himself? A prosecution report filed on August 15th, 1973 gives us a clear image of what occurred. Quote, defendant Norman John David, age 45, place of arrest 371618 Cole Avenue, number 208. Date and time of arrest, August 14th, 1973 at 8 o'clock p.m. Violation Article 725B, Section 2, Texas Penal Code. End quote. Unbelievable though it might be, Article 725B of the Texas Penal Code has nothing to do with or the of children. It only has relevance to charges. So, in an apartment with 5 teenage boys filled with CSAM materials, or as it was referred to at the time, and the obvious signs of the solicitation of minors. Keep in mind there was also photographic equipment found there while these teenage boys were there amongst the CSAM materials. John David Norman, on his prosecution report, I'll give you guys a second to guess what he was charged with. Possession of marijuana. That's what he was charged with. 20 grams of marijuana in a plastic bag were found in his apartment, and it was all the police needed to sweep the rest of the incident under the rug. Here's the case summary as it was written. Quote, on August 14th, 1973, Detective W.K. King of the Dallas Police Youth Division received information from a confidential informant that John David Norman was operating a ring at his apartment located at 3716 Cole Avenue, apartment number 208. The informant also told Detective King that John David Norman had a large number of files in his apartment which listed the names of out-of-town persons who were involved in committing acts of sodomy with friends of John Norman. Detective King then obtained an implement search warrant from Municipal Court Judge George L. Orndorff, then notified officers J.R. Landers, B.C. Nelson, and C.K. Springer of the Special Investigations Unit. Officers Landers, Nelson, and Springer went to the above location and placed the location under visual surveillance, awaiting the arrival of Detective King with the search warrant. When officers were notified by police radio that the search warrant had been obtained, Officer Landers went to the apartment manager's office to obtain a passkey for apartment number 208. While Officer Landers was inside the manager's apartment, John David Norman came out of his apartment and was stopped by Detective Springer. Detective Springer then advised John Norman that a search warrant had been issued for his apartment. At that time, officers Landers, Nelson, and Springer entered the apartment and began a search of the residence. Officers located several boxes of index cards bearing the names of persons suspected of committing acts of sodomy with friends of John Norman. As officers were gathering up the files and nude pictures of males and placing them near the front door, Detective Nelson observed John David Norman take something from his pocket and place it underneath him in a chair. Detective Nelson observed the evidence listed as Exhibit A as this case on top of the chair cushion. Detective Nelson then seized this evidence and released it to Officer Landers. When the search of the apartment was concluded, the officers placed John David Norman and several young white males under arrest for investigation of conspiracy to commit sodomy. John David Norman was also charged with investigation violation state narcotic law. John David Norman and the other persons arrested were then transported to City Hall and placed in jail on the above charges. Officer Landers then initiated and dated the evidence for further identification and deposited the evidence in the locked evidence box located in the crime scene search section of the Dallas Police Department. End quote. The evidence that they were talking about in that prosecution report that he took out of his pocket and placed under the chair was the marijuana, and somehow it was the only penal code charge listed on the report. Strangely, though he was surrounded by teenagers and CSAM materials, John David Norman got away with only a narcotics charge and conspiracy to commit sodomy. The day after the arrest, on August 15th, the public learned about the index cards, the booklets with pictures and names of teenagers and adult men, and most horrifically, the photos in that book that had the word kill scribbled across them. The police, though, seemed not to be concerned about the children marked for death in that book. In the news stories that followed, they stated something almost completely unbelievable. There was, quote, no immediate evidence to link the operation in Dallas to the discovery of the torture murder ring in Houston, end quote. Captain Newman of the Dallas Police made this claim and told news outlets that he didn't think the two were related whatsoever. As for John Norman himself, he was released that same day on a $7,000 bond after police filed charges of state 1 narcotics laws. But the paper does bring us some good news. Charges of conspiracy to commit a felony sodomy and contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile would be filed against John David Norman on August 16th. Police Chief Steele would comment on the enormity of the operation immediately afterwards. United States Postal Inspectors and the Internal Revenue Service entered the investigation afterwards, and Chief Steele stated that investigators were only scratching the surface of something much bigger. The police didn't know where this operation would lead, and in all of his years, Chief Steele had never seen an operation quite like this. It's still unknown how John David Norman created this operation, one so massive that it spanned the entire United States, and how he created this so quickly. Indeed, the discovery was only the tip of the iceberg, but after being charged with possession of marijuana, conspiracy to commit sodomy, and contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile, John David Norman was free. Remember, he wasn't locked away and hidden from society. Even with his previous rap sheet of being arrested for those charges in California involving minors, 4 different arrests dealing with and the of minors. He was released on bail. An anonymous benefactor, in fact, someone who has never been identified, had helped John David Norman with his $35,000 expense. And with his new freedom, John David Norman fled the state. This anonymous benefactor who paid John David Norman's bail and his legal fees, who, like I said before, has never been identified to this day, must have really wanted John David Norman out of prison and must have really wanted John David Norman not to talk to investigators, because the amount adjusted for inflation that this anonymous individual paid on John David Norman's behalf, they paid for his freedom, was equal to roughly $248,548 in today's money. By fleeing the state, John David Norman's bail was forfeited, but that didn't matter for the career criminal. This time, John fled to Illinois, the very same place where another killer would soon be uncovered. Now, it should be noted too that we're going to examine the much deeper, much darker connections between John David Norman and Dean Corll in our next episode. This is a very, very broad strokes version of the story because there are so many connections, like one of Dean Corll's accomplices saying that he was working with a guy in Dallas who ran a ring. The Snuff films and the evidence that went missing and the 4 tons of CSAM materials that were discovered in a warehouse in Houston. There's just so much to get into there. But keep in mind, we're just going through the John David Norman story. Then we're going to deconstruct it in the upcoming episodes of this series. So keep in mind, John David Norman has been arrested those previous 4 or 5 times. I think it's 4 or maybe 5, including the stuff in California. I can't remember exactly. There's so many charges. He's been arrested many times for materials involving children, for the force in general. Then he's arrested and he's found in an apartment with 5 teenagers, children, CSAM CP materials strewn throughout the apartment, photographic material found in the apartment. It is documented that he was running a service where could pay to rent children and take them across state lines, and he escapes. They allow him to post bond and he flees. And if you think that he stops, he doesn't. It gets so much significantly worse. You see, it wasn't long after John David Norman fled that he ended up in Homewood, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. It was late August or early September 1973 when Norman arrived in Illinois. And when there, he began using the name Stephen Gurwell and living with a client that he had met through another name for one of his programs, Epic International. The man who Norman was living with was later identified as Charles Railing, who had ordered a 16-year-old boy from John David Norman's mail service and had taken the child out of the country with him to Europe. While staying in Homewood, Illinois, John David Norman would make victims out of many teenaged boys and children, with at least 10 victims having been eventually confirmed. And the Homewood Police Department would be tipped off pretty quickly about John David Norman's activities via an anonymous informant. You see, Norman had been using underage boys for and immediately returned to his scheme and his literally, it seems like almost immediately after leaving Texas and escaping those charges, he started doing the exact same thing again in Illinois. The anonymous informant who informed the police about Norman was a boy named Kenneth Hellstrom, who told local police in Illinois that he had gone over to John David Norman's apartment with a man who offered him beer. Inside, the young man was by John David Norman and forced into receiving from him. The Homewood detectives immediately followed up on this tip. When the police arrived at John David Norman's home on the outskirts of Homewood, however, Norman happened to be out of town. Railing, though, Norman's friend, was kind enough to let the police into his home. Once inside, the police found the same Odyssey Foundation materials that the authorities in Dallas had discovered. This once again included the client lists and photographs of boys with descriptions, essentially the exact same materials and note cards and client list that were found in Dallas. I mean, it was practically identical materials that were now discovered in Illinois. Railing, Norman's friend, was cooperative with the police and told them that he had leased his apartment to someone named Stephen Gurwell from Dallas, who he knew had been operating a callboy service. When Homewood PD detectives spoke to Dallas PD, the detectives in Homewood soon realized that Stephen Gurwell was in fact John David Norman. Once they learned that, It was only a matter of surveilling the apartment and then taking Norman into custody. Once Norman returned from his trip to locations unknown, we still don't know where he was and what he was doing at that time. Norman was arrested on November 14th, 1973. Now sitting in a Cook County jail, John David Norman was very unlikely to be set free like he had been in Dallas. The previous bail of $35,000 was then upped to $325,000, which would be equal to about $2,308,000 today. That's a pretty high bail. I'm sure there were lots of individuals that wanted Norman out of prison and didn't want Norman to talk, but none of them were willing to shell out $2 million. And if they had shelled out that much money, it would have made things look even more suspicious than they already did. So finally, we have a little bit of good news here. John David Norman ends up being locked away for some of his crimes. And this must be where he was finally stopped, at least for a while, right? Well, sadly, no. You see, through an absolutely unbelievable turn of events, John David Norman would actually continue to run his mail service and newsletter from inside the Cook County jail while he was in prison, while he was in jail being held on these charges. John David Norman somehow was allowed to continue to operate his newsletter and his mailing service. The people who wanted him out couldn't spring him without raising eyebrows, so instead, somehow, he was allowed to continue his evil work from inside prison walls. You see, while inside the Cook County jail, inexplicably, John David Norman was granted access to the publishing, printing, and mailing facilities that he needed to produce and distribute the literature for his Odyssey Foundation network. So now you have John David Norman running a from inside of prison, but this time it had a new name. Eyebrows would have been raised, obviously, if the publication had continued to print without a hitch. So, thinking fast, Norman changed the title of the Odyssey Foundation to the Delta Project. As stated in the book The Eye of the Chicken Hawk by Simon Dovey, quote, "It was nothing but a fresh coat of paint given to the same boy scheme he'd deployed through the mail for years," end quote. Now, Norman continued to run his callboy network while in prison under direct supervision of the guards and advertised his Delta Project in a newsletter called Hermes or Hermes. He sent out 3 copies of this newsletter saying that the Delta Project served the same purpose as the Odyssey Foundation, and it was an educational program for boys where older men could meet up with younger children to mentor them. Norman advised as well in his newsletter that Delta dorms were being established across the country, where 2 to 4 cadets, formerly known as fellows, which obviously were children, would be overseen by a Don or an older man. Sickeningly, the paper detailed that the relationship between the Don and cadets was left entirely between them. Police would eventually make the connection that these cadets that John David Norman was talking about were underage males recruited from Chicago, but by the time that they learned about the newsletter, Norman had already been operating it unimpeded for ages. Someone had to have been telling the Cook County guards to look the other way, because John David Norman was committing the exact same crimes that he had been arrested for, now from within prison walls. But he didn't do it alone. Norman had an accomplice, someone who was very willing and able to help him out. His accomplice's name was Philip Paskey, who later on in 1978 would become an employee of none other than John Wayne Gacy and his business PDM Contracting. Philip Paskey at the time had been arrested for murder, but pleaded the charges down to theft and became a close friend and associate of John David Norman's while he was incarcerated. But Norman and Paskey wouldn't have to run the business from prison for too long. In 1975, John David Norman's charges from his 1973 arrest in Dallas were dismissed, likely because the evidence had been completely destroyed by the State Department. Norman's bail, as a result, was then reduced from $325,000 to $36,000, and that money was once again quickly posted by an anonymous benefactor, who to this day has still never been identified. In the early part of 1976, Norman walked out of the Cook County Jail, but he had gained a new accomplice. Throughout his time in prison, Norman had been pleading for bail for not just himself, but for Philip Paskey as well, and he called Philip his right-hand man. Patrons of John David Norman's newsletter happily obliged to the pleads for Philip's bail. Philip was released on probation in January of the same year after reaching a plea deal in his murder case, and after he was released, he and Norman began to work together just as before. They had been working together to run this from inside prison. Now, inexplicably, shortly afterwards, the both of them are outside of prison walls, and of course, they link up again and continue to run this thing. During this time, Norman also picked up another alias. This time, he wanted people to call him John Shanks. Norman didn't stay free for long, however. In November, he was indicted on 5 counts, having returned to the same crimes he had been committing for years. Eventually, he was found guilty of contributing to the delinquency of a minor and ordered to 4 years in prison, plus 1 day on the 30th of that month. He received 23 months of credit for time served, but it still meant that Norman was in for another long haul. This time, he was sent to the Pontiac Correctional Center to serve out his sentence. Meanwhile, though, Philip Paskey, Norman's right-hand man, remained on the outside. Upon his own release, Paskey had registered his and Norman's names to a post office box in Chicago for mailings. His probation record states that he worked for Norman's Delta Project as an employee and earned about $3 an hour. But Philip Paskey wasn't just a paper boy. He all but ran the business while John David Norman was behind bars. But once again, that's the official story. We're talking about a story right here where all these index cards are taken by the US State Department and destroyed. Evidence of a is destroyed by a US government agency. The main guy who's running this ring is allowed to operate in prison. So everything you read and every outcome in the story you have to take with a grain of salt, because none of it makes sense, and it just never will unless you start reading between the lines. Because you see, as Kenneth Hellstrom met an untimely end, John David Norman was still running his Delta Project newsletter from behind prison walls. John David Norman had become infamous by this point and was a big name in crime in Chicago. Naturally, an interview he gave was covered in a story by the Chicago Tribune. In an article titled "Chicago is the Center of National," published on Monday, May 16, 1977, Norman's Delta Project newsletter is discussed in detail. Norman, speaking with the interviewer, naturally kept up his lies and said that the Delta Project had nothing to do with. He said that this was all purely good-intentioned and educational and was a good project to help young men. But the police saw through his explanations. They knew what these dons Norman had advertised in his newsletter were. That were overseeing underage boy, practically holding them hostage in housing arrangements. Norman in the interview also went into detail about just how much work he had put into the newsletter, a sickening thought when considering what the newsletter detailed. Norman in the interview stated, quote, "It was quite a project and I would work all day, 16 hours, and I paid another inmate to do the typing and other work during the other 8 hours of the day," end quote. The other inmate was undoubtedly Philip Paskey. Norman was absolutely brazen in his interview, saying that after his release, he would be going into the business of selling TV cassettes, but of course he denied to the reporter that any children would be involved. After the coverage of his interview, the article went on to show just how many people had been reading his sick materials. Norman had been in correspondence with over 7,000 people before the newsletter had finally been stopped while he was in prison. Around March of the same year, the Delta Project material was discovered in a local magazine and was traced back to John David Norman. Once again, inexplicably, in May of 1977, John David Norman was released from prison early. Suddenly, now that Norman could no longer write his newsletter in prison, he was released by a judge with almost little to no explanation. This obviously seems like a gross miscarriage of justice, especially since Norman would quickly return to his work after being released, turning the Delta Project into something called the Creative Corps and MC Publications, standing for Mail Call, M-A-L-E, Call. Moving into a basement apartment with Philip Paskey on West Wrightwood Avenue in Chicago, John David Norman, immediately after being released from prison, then set up a photography studio in this apartment with blacked out windows. Shortly afterwards, he began recruiting children from all over Chicago to take part in video and photo shoots and at this address. The operation was allowed to continue on until June of 1978, when the apartment was finally raided by police. You see, a 17-year-old boy named Michael Salcido had reported John David Norman to the police because he had. Upon raiding the apartment, once again, detectives found between 50 to 100,000 pink index cards, which named and listed in explicit detail John David Norman's extensive client list and their preferences, as well as mass amounts of CSAM and along with equipment and paraphernalia used to make explicit materials. And this is interesting here. We see at this point that not only were the note cards in this case listing the names and addresses of the clients of John David Norman's, but it states in reporting that they also actually listed out what these men were into, like their specific fetishes and kind of what they wanted their victims to look like, height, weight, age, hair color, eye color, really intimate details. The police learned that the file cards also listed radio information, indicating that information from John David Norman could be passed via CB radio messages, which violated federal law. They also gathered evidence that the ring was shipping boys across state lines and even at times out of the United States for obviously another federal violation. During the time of his arrest, police learned that one boy was already in the process of waiting for John David Norman to sell him to a man in Canada. This operation clearly had grown and was no longer explicitly localized within the United States. When the news broke, 50-year-old John David Norman was titled in the papers as the ringleader of one of the country's largest mail order operations. Yet nothing ever came of the pink index cards that listed his clientele. Interestingly, this is about the same amount of index cards that were destroyed by the State Department years earlier. Either Norman took the time to create those 50 to 100,000 index cards all over again, writing them down by hand, all about 100,000 of them, or perhaps the cards were actually never destroyed at all. John David Norman's charges for his arrest were for the of two boys, one being 16 and the other being 17. He was also charged with taking of them. Both were foster children, wards of the Department of Children and Family Services. John David Norman would once again be put on trial and another witness would be asked to testify. But John David Norman had had this problem once before, and simply because his victim had the courage to speak up, in February of 1979, he would meet a grisly end. You see, Michael Salcido, the very boy who had reported John David Norman to the police, was found dead in a car at 3 a.m. along with two other boys. Their throats in a fashion that the papers at the time called ritualistic. It was later revealed that members of the Latin Kings gang committed these murders, but news sources denied that these gangsters had any connection to John David Norman. It was once again extremely good timing for John David Norman that a witness that had turned him in, that was sent to testify against him, would be murdered with a knife. John David Norman was then set to go on trial for his participation in the running of a nationwide. And Salcido, that victim, along with the other boy, Kenneth Hellstrom, would have been perfect to testify against him. But they had been silenced by what are undoubtedly, in my mind, allies of John David Norman's, who likely profited off of his child or used it for their own sickening pleasure. From here, the Hellstrom and Salcido murders go cold. That is, until in 2005, Kenneth Hellstrom's sister pulled out a biography about John Wayne Gacy out of the local library. Someone had written notes down inside, tying a connection between her brother, Kenneth Hellstrom, to John David Norman, and then to John Wayne Gacy. Apparently, many years after he committed the murders he became famous for, John Wayne Gacy was interviewed about the murder of Kenneth Hellstrom in the 1990s. And what's more disturbing, the apartment that Paskey and Norman had set up in would be located only 20 miles away from where the bodies of Gacy's 29 victims would be found in his cellar. A murderer had never been brought to justice in the case of Kenneth Hellstrom, but that wouldn't last forever. A strange perpetrator would eventually be found, one that only just fit the bill to tie up loose ends. You see, 2 years after Kenneth Hellstrom's sister checked out the biography on John Wayne Gacy, an old classmate of Kenneth Hellstrom's named Fred Rogers was pulled over in a traffic stop. He had been a suspect in Kenneth's case the entire time, but had left Chicago and was never able to be located. Now, 30 years later, the classmate had returned to the city. Rogers inexplicably immediately confessed to the murder of Kenneth Hellstrom while talking to the police and said that he had seen Kenneth Hellstrom after he made unwanted advances on him while the two were smoking pot. This was enough for the Chicago Police Department, and the case was immediately closed. Kenneth had been a key witness in one of John David Norman's trials, and Rogers' confession just didn't fit. Certainly, Hellstrom's mother didn't seem to think so. Before his death, Hellstrom had asked his mother to switch rooms with his sister. He wanted to go to the upstairs bedroom because he told his mom he was afraid. When his mother asked him why, Kenneth had told her that it was because he was certain someone was looking for him. but he wouldn't tell her who that was. Philip Paskey certainly wasn't above murder, and this only becomes more clear when another associate is connected to his case. You see, in 1978, Philip Paskey lost his job as a children's supervisor at a local swimming pool. Soon afterwards, he got a job, not coincidentally in my mind, with PBM Contracting, working under the infamous killer clown John Wayne Gacy. 3 different payslip receipts were found for Philip Paskey under John Wayne Gacy's company, but Paskey would later reportedly, allegedly, be fired from the company. This, though, was only the tip of the iceberg of the connections between John Wayne Gacy and John David Norman. But for now, we have to return to John David Norman's next move after he was once again released from prison. By the year 1983, John David Norman was freed yet again. Without his key witnesses, he had little to worry about in the trial for his nationwide. The justice system had allowed him to continue his disgusting business time and time again, even going so far as to allow him to write his newsletters in prison. And I don't know if I stressed this enough earlier, but I want you to remember the index cards after John David Norman is arrested in Dallas are destroyed by the State Department. When he's arrested again in Illinois and that same amount of index cards are found, they go missing. There's no record of what happens to them. They just disappear from the evidence room. Both times that these note cards containing a practical directory of powerful in America, both times that these cards are found, they vanish. They're either destroyed or they literally disappear from evidence. And there have been interviews with officials in Chicago where they asked about what happened to the cards. People just say they don't know. They have no idea. They just literally just disappeared. It's like a ghost. They were there 1 second and then all of a sudden they're gone. 1 time is extremely, incredibly, disturbingly suspicious. 2 times, I don't know how you can deny that there isn't or wasn't some sort of higher up protection that was afforded to John David Norman. You don't have evidence like that, extremely damning evidence, go missing or be destroyed if you don't have people in the system that are protecting you. It just makes no sense. But eventually, John David Norman posts bail again in Illinois and flees the state, just like he had done in Texas, which meant he had to forfeit his freedom, but as before, this mattered very little to him. Now, there isn't a lot of information about what John David Norman did between the time he posted bail and the time he appeared again in news headlines, but it can be said for certain that he continued to publish his newsletters, which obviously were connecting to children and disseminating CSAM materials. You see, on Halloween 1984, the Gettysburg Times in Pennsylvania published an article titled "Man Held on Charge." The paper spoke about a Heidelberg man who had been placed in an Adams County prison after he was arraigned on an 18-count complaint. Was included in the charges. John David Norman, now 56 years old, had been going by at the time the name Clarence McKay and had been placed in prison for 3 counts of involuntary indecent exposure and 3 misdemeanor charges of corruption of the morals of minors, as well as of children and interference of custody. Norman had been using boys once again to publish a newsletter, this time called Handy Andy, the same type of newsletter that he had been publishing all his life. Norman had exploited at least 20 different teenage boys for the 2 years the newsletter had been in operation, and had used a rural home near Aspers, Pennsylvania, and an efficiency apartment at a Cumberland Township motel to carry this thing out. Norman had tried to get ahead of the law this time when he was inevitably reported to the police by a victim. Now, at this point, Norman was wanted in 5 different states, but when he found out his home had been raided on May 31st, 1984, he tried to escape once again, but this time back to Illinois. And outrunning the law worked for a time. He hid, most likely in Illinois under another alias, until October of 1984, about a year after that article was published, when he was captured in Bolingbrook, Illinois. Norman proved to be something of a jailhouse lawyer, though, and successfully filed a writ to have his bail reduced to an affordable amount. When he posted his $7,500 bail in March of 1985, he fled the state once again and remained hidden until 1987. During this time, the famous Finders investigation was in full swing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. After being released, once again, and this is mind-blowing to me, how they keep releasing him or allowing him to post bond when literally every single time he's recorded to have bailed out, he flees. Like, this dude is like the biggest flight risk in America. He has never stuck around to see his charges through or to serve his sentence, and yet they still kept giving him a ridiculously low amount of bail money, or low priced bail, however you would say that, and they allowed him to just keep going. And once again, he went into hiding. But finally, he was arrested near the University of Illinois in August of 1987. He was found this time in an apartment with a 20-year-old man named Eric Kimball after police received a tip that a man in that apartment was involved in the area. When police came to the apartment, they found a computerized publishing operation that was being used for exactly the same child that John David Norman had been secretly running for years. After his discovery, Norman and the man Eric Kimball, who he was living with, were both taken into custody, with Norman then being sentenced to 6 years in prison in Illinois for the crimes he had committed in the state. Either Eric couldn't live with what he had done, or something more sinister was at play, because soon after his arrest, he attempted to self-delete in his jail cell by with his teeth, but he was unsuccessful. After John David Norman's arrest in Illinois, Pennsylvania authorities wanted to extradite him so that he could finish serving his sentence there, and they eventually got their wish. In Pennsylvania, Norman was sentenced to 18 to 36 months for charges related to the Handy Andy publication. After his inevitable release, John David Norman then fled to Colorado, then to California, where he would finally be put away forever. In Colorado in 1988, John David Norman was again arrested and convicted of, but there's little news on the circumstances, and it's kind of hard to track down the exact details of what happened. After this offense, though, when he was released from prison shortly afterwards, he moved to California, where he again continued publishing his newsletters. In the case text for People vs. Norman, published in 2010, it stated that John David Norman was out on bail for a charge in 1995 when he was caught publishing and describing explicit of 14 to 18-year-old boys. Finally, in 1999, after serving a prison term for again distributing, Norman was declared a violent predator and confined permanently at the Atascadero State Hospital in California. That wasn't the end, however. In 2008, the LA Times published a story called "Judge Sends to Rural Town." You see, once again, inexplicably, for some reason, John David Norman, even though he had been declared a violent predator, he was released from that state hospital and sent to live in a small town near the border of Mexico called Boulevard. In March of that year, 2008, a judge had stated that Norman should return to society after the 6 years he had spent in an inpatient program at Atascadero. Under a law called Jessica's Law, violent predators must be placed in rural areas away from facilities used by children. But, of course, this did not stop John David Norman. It was only the 2nd of February 2009 when John David Norman violated the conditions of his release from the hospital by giving his contact information to a 19-year-old grocery bagger in nearby El Centro. Norman had also violated the terms of his release by attempting to get a roommate, using a telephone service and placing an ad in the newspaper. He had failed to be active in treatment, corresponded with another known, had clipped out photos of young men and boys from newspapers and magazines to keep in his home for unspeakable purposes, and had even placed an ad in the Gay and Lesbian Times. This advertisement read, quote, "Unique old guy, needs a younger guy as a roommate and companion, is more interested in company than pay little or nothing for room and board," end quote. And John David Norman was still writing as a hobby. And so when the judge asked him why he had cut the photos of young men and boys out of the papers, he said that it helped him to be descriptive in his writing. He also said he was desperate to have a roommate because of his fragile health, but no one bought these explanations. He also claimed he was incredibly lonely and that he had given his contact information to the bagger because it was someone who was actually willing to speak with him. By now, John David Norman was looked at as a sad case, an old man near the end of his life, not as a dangerous predator, though he undoubtedly still was and always would be. A story by the San Diego Union Tribune called him tragic, and so did his therapist, Dr. Michael Rivas. Norman was still resistant to treatment and truly didn't believe he had ever harmed any of his victims, many of whom had been teenagers or even younger. Because of everything Norman had done, he got no sympathy from his treatment providers. They disliked him, and no one can begrudge them that. Finally, because of Norman's offenses, he was sent to Coalinga State Hospital in Fresno County, a completely locked and secure facility. Deputy District Attorney Phyllis Shess stated that Norman was not ready to be released into society as his former judge had believed and needed further time in incarceration. John David Norman would then live out the rest of his life in state custody at that hospital, and he would die there from old age in 2011 at age 83. That's where the life of John David Norman ends, but it isn't at all where his story does. John David Norman by this time had been associated with Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. You see, John David Norman was free and at his work while the finders were being investigated, but they aren't the only other that he may have been a part of. You see, in 2013, Ted Gunderson interviewed Paul Benassi, a famed victim of the infamous Franklin Credit Union. The FCU pilfered young children from children's homes and sold them to high-ranking government officials for means of blackmail throughout the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. It is thought that many of the FCU perpetrators were also Delta Project clients because of the tens of thousands of pink index cards found in Norman's apartment not once, but multiple times that always inexplicably went missing. During his interview, Paul Benassi mentioned being by a Chicago school teacher named Joe Reynolds, a man who procured children for a nationwide boy. The man, Paul said, kept a collection of pink filing cards listing customers and the boys they liked. This matches perfectly with Norman's index cards, which listed all of his clients and, like I said, their sick preferences. Benassi also said that when the man was arrested on charges, law enforcement discovered his file cards. He also said that the man had an extensive history of crimes against children. Benassi stated that in the apartment where these filing cards were kept, he performed administrative tasks for the child pandering network, and that two of the names on the cards were Alan Baer and Harold Anderson, both of whom were implicated in the Franklin Credit Union. Based on Benassi's descriptions, it can be thought that John David Norman was the man in Chicago, the man with the pink file cards, and the man who ran a boy. If this were the case, the Franklin Credit Union leaders likely bought or utilized boys from John David Norman's network, or in some capacity worked together with him. It's hard to think that these two incidents could be isolated. Both operated at the same time, both were nationwide, and both allegedly had clients in America's upper crust. If that's the case, it may not only be true that the government is run by and profiting off of, it may also have very well profited off of the of children. The connections between John David Norman, John Wayne Gacy, and Dean Corll somewhat defy belief, and only the most surface-level correlations have been made up until this point. However, soon, the lines will further be drawn between these three heinous criminals. Connecting John David Norman to these men is not just a matter of operating in the same place at the same time. The same names will appear in all three cases, creating ties that are much too strong to be coincidence. But for John David Norman, what we find is a man who would not give up his dark desires, or perhaps he had someone ordering him to continue despite being caught time and time again. Light prison sentence after light prison sentence was served, and yet he continued to carry out his newsletter scheme. Most criminals, after being caught so many times, would simply give up. But Norman didn't only not give in to the law, he was practically pressed into continuing by anonymous benefactors who continuously paid his way to freedom, judges who inexplicably released him from prison, or even the unthinkable truth that he was allowed to continue his business from inside prison walls. Who else could make all of these things happen but the very justice system that placed him behind those bars to begin with? Who else could pull the strings to not only keep him in business, but also to silence those who spoke out against him and keep their true killers free from the charges? Perhaps the Latin Kings members were paid off by Norman and his dark masters, or perhaps the true killer was Philip Paskey and the gang members were simply fall guys, as Fred Rogers may have been. John David Norman seemed to have opportunities handed to him on a silver platter every time he was arrested, and for that matter, since he was a teen. He was given scholarships, radio jobs, and awards for his writing, all factors that likely played a large role in what he would go on to do. Was John David Norman selected for this grim work and groomed for his position from a young age, or was he simply a monster that found his way into a larger den of darkness? John David Norman was undoubtedly protected by his own government, the people meant to stop him, but did he work with the finders and the Franklin Credit Union, the organizations responsible for some of the greatest crimes against children this country has ever seen? It could be that John David acted alone, but with the information that comes with his connections to the Killer Clown and the Candyman, one starts to wonder if everything isn't intertwined, a massive that feeds off of the destruction of innocence and the murder of children. John David Norman died in a state hospital, alone, no longer the architect of evil he had once been, a shell of his former self. He wasted away behind the walls of an institution, but likely the work he began only continued on with a new master. Norman was not the first of his kind, nor would he be the last. Even to this day, connections are being made that link the FCU ring to things like Epstein, the MIT ring, and so much more. Someone is out there pulling the strings, choosing a new headmaster to orchestrate this demonic consortium when another falls away. Was John David Norman a head of procurement for this secret cabal? And could he have been the centerpiece for the country's largest betrayal of trust? And yet, this is not the end of the story. There are much greater, much darker beasts, much stronger connections, much more disturbing evidence. Films and celebrities and government officials and documents and names and places that we haven't even touched on in this episode that all circulate once again around John David Norman. This is America's best kept secret, America's greatest lie. The dreadful presence of these individuals and these documents is woven into the fabric of power and influence, well obscured from the public eye and from those who would seek to destroy them. These figures, cloaked in their own anonymity and shaped by fiendish acts, have manipulated events for decades, orchestrating this madness to meet their own sinister ends. As Norman's tale unfolds even further, it becomes clear that he was only a pawn in a much larger game, a puppet dancing to a macabre marching tune. This song these dark masters designed will never stop, and has not stopped since his death, and will not stop until the truth is revealed for all. But we are way over time for this week, and that's where we have to stop it here. So this entire month, we are doing the extended series on John David Norman, my deepest, darkest dive to date on any criminal or ring in the history of the show. So join me next week for part 2 of the John David Norman story. This is going to be a 3-part series deconstructing Norman and his connections and his ties to different organizations and people, and his crimes, and just so many things we haven't been able to talk about in this one episode. There's a lot of information here, but it's a very brief, wide overview. As you're going to see in the next 2 episodes, we're going to really examine links and information and documents that exist dealing with Norman in the next few weeks. But please, if you have enjoyed, I know it's not enjoyable to listen to this stuff, but if you've enjoyed learning about this stuff and you want to help me raise awareness about these things, please do consider, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and leaving me a comment. If you're listening to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave me a 5-star review. We are going to be back next week with part 2 of this 3-part series. I am so excited to dive even deeper with you guys, and hopefully you learned something today, because the truth will set you free. That's really what it all boils down to. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much for joining me. Keep that tinfoil hat on. Always question everything. Stay suspicious. And yeah, I'll see you next week.